Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, or good night, everybody. You are watching or listening to another episode of But Before We Go, my name's Bill Woodcock.
And I'm Steve Hunt.
And Steve, I am still hesitating on that another episode of But Before We Go because I need to not remember the old podcast name. I have to remember the current podcast name. So a couple
Correct.
things from our first episode that people out there in viewer and listener land have chimed in on. One, identify where we are. Well, if Steve's HC emblazoned hat and shirt with, and I may say, emblazoned with authority and exceptionalism, have not clued you in. We are both located in the beautiful suburb of Howard County, Maryland. And if you don't think it's beautiful, just ask anyone who lives here. So then the second thing is, why do you cuss so much? Because that's how we talk. So if you don't like it, too effing bad. So that's just the way of the world. Can't help it. Won't stop it. If you don't like it, find another podcast to watch or listen to. What do I care? And that provides, in a way, a devious segue into our topic du
Well,
jour. Steve, take her away.
we are starting to get into these different topics, and as you said, our last podcast we got into a certain food like substance. I will be generous.
They are food.
And
Don't say they're food like. Now that pasty
okay,
shit was food like. But anyway, the Pop Tart,
yes.
yes.
So for our first episode, we got into one of the staples of our childhood, and that would be Pop Tarts. Today, we're going to talk about, and I think Bill, I may have come up with this name, or somebody else did, and I just suggested it as the name of this episode. You can't say that on television. And what we're going to do today is talk about those things that our young eyes had to view that young eyes today would never be able to view because those things would be canceled in about 5.5 minutes, if that.
Oh
Because
yeah. Oh
I
yeah.
will tell you, television in the 70s was truly the wild, wild west. And no, I'm not talking about the show called The Wild, Wild West. I believe that was in the 60s.
Although I used to watch reruns of that, and that show with Robert Conrad and Ross Martin
Oh,
as
yeah.
the first two Secret Service agents, pretty tight.
Yeah.
That
If
was
you,
like a Western version of James Bond. I like that, or
yeah,
a Western version of The Man from Uncle. Knockoffs of a knockoff. I dug that. But
yeah,
anyway, the
yes,
whole thing of digging into specific shows. Oh my God, hundreds of episodes possible just off of that.
yes, sir.
But no, I mean, but you're talking more about the language
Yes,
and how
absolutely.
we carried on in the 70s. Give me some examples, kind sir.
Well, and it really wasn't so much about words as it was about subject matter. And then there were a few words because for those of you who don't remember, the late great George Carlin, one of his iconic routines, and it actually was, I believe, from the 1970s, was the 7 words you can't say on television. And the censorship that went along with those 7 words. And because, Bill, you mentioned our use of the English language in one of our respondents' feedback, I will not mention the 7 words that George Carlin referred to, but they were words that censors would always flag. So those words were not used, but there were certainly subject matters that were on television then that would never be on now. And the first one I will just go right into, Bill, was if you ever watched the old Saturday Night Live, which, oh, by the way, is the best Saturday Night Live. I think, you have the Chevy Chase Belushi days, you have the Murphy days, and on and on and on. And we could compare eras, but the original Saturday Night Live was hysterical. And one of the iconic skits was between Chevy Chase and Richard Pryor. Now, you're probably already laughing because you're thinking, those two guys, holy shit. Yes, I just cursed. But it was word association. And every racial epithet, every racial stereotype, every racial slur was compacted into this, I don't know, 7 or 10 minutes. And it was the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. Could they run that today? No. first of all, the N word would get you kicked out in the first place, but everything else would also get you totally wiped out. If SNL tried this one, they would get torched. But in 1975, 76, it was about the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. But you can't do that on television today.
I think that if you tried to do such a thing on television today, the cancellation one would receive would be spherical in nature. It would be from all sides. It would be from all levels of the socioeconomic chain. It would be from all geographical regions. It would be a sphere. You would be buried inside the core of a massive sphere of cancellation if you
Mhm.
tried to do that sort of thing today. But as we know, having been children of the 70s and 80s, that was Richard Pryor's humor. That's
Yeah.
who he was. You mentioned George Carlin's 7 words. Bill Maher had a thing on a couple weeks ago on his show. All the 7 words get said now.
Yes,
They're
they
no
do.
longer taboo, but there are still some topics, and I think recent decades have brought a lot of other ideas and issues to the fore. I mean, Modern Family gave us, same-sex couples, and it wasn't the first episode, it wasn't the first show to do that. And we remember Soap.
I was
Remember
going to say
Soap? Billy
Billy
Crystal
Crystal.
played the first gay character on network television. Oh my God, what a big thing that was.
Right,
But that's only very normally become normal, quote unquote.
right.
Um, I'm gonna hold up, So Billy Crystal is one of those ideas. So let's put a pin on that and maybe get back to that later, if
Yes.
as time permits. But I'm gonna hold up the entire body of work of one great late Norman Lear,
There it is. I was
who
waiting for it.
who who hit every bumper on the pinball machine of taboo subjects that you could, and used those words and showed those themes in the most graphic yet also comical way possible. Whether it was Archie Bunker flying out the N word and every possible word for every possible ethnic group that you could name, to George Jefferson and his liberal use of the term honky and hatred of the white man and everything else, and let's not throw out Maud with the themes of misogyny, sexism, a little bit ageism,
Mhm.
in that show. One Day at a Time was a single mother, you
Yep.
know, every, and the stigma associated with that,
Yep.
every single 70s social third rail,
Mhm.
he didn't just tiptoe on it, he danced on the sucker.
If you want to look up the definition of not having any F's to give, you'd find a picture of Norman Lear. He literally did not care. Like you said, Archie Bunker, you know, for those people who are like, "Oh my God, Al Bundy is kind of out there." No, Al Bundy is a walk in the park next to Archie Bunker. Al Bundy would get thrown out of Archie Bunker's house. Okay, um, Archie Bunker was. I remember the episode with Sammy Davis Jr. and
I was just thinking of that.
And that one was absolutely hysterical. But yeah, Archie went after everybody. He went after black people. He went after gay people. He went after Polish people. He went after liberals. I mean, Rob Reiner, everybody knows Rob Reiner as this kind of stately, world famous, iconic director. Rob Reiner's start, remember, married to Archie
Yeah.
Bunker's daughter. Yes, Meathead. So there was that. And you're right. There was George Jefferson, and oh my God, George and just the neighbors. And remember their neighbors, the Willises, not just an interracial couple, but an interracial couple with a white husband and a black wife. So you started to get interracial couples a little bit on television, but it was always black man, white woman. They reversed that shit. So you
Right.
had that. You had Maud, and oh, by the way, one of my childhood crushes, Adrienne Barbeau on
I
on
was gonna
Maud.
say you weren't gonna say B. Arthur.
Oh hell no. But they got into abortion. If you remember the one episode they talked about abortion, and that was not very long after Roe v. Wade. And you mentioned One Day at a Time, and I could go on. I mean, Norman Lear, you could we could do a whole podcast about Norman Lear, what he meant to comedy, and the fact that Norman Lear could not exist today because the stuff he went deep into, nobody's touching that now, ever, ever. I mean, they might lightly tread on it, but like you said, Norman jumped in with both feet, hip waders on, and dared you to do something about it. And God bless him.
Well, and I think there's an important make a point to make here, maybe a bit of a distinction, because we're also talking about Norman like he was some sort of like maverick. He really wasn't. I mean, think about what we're talking about. Think about all the guest stars who were on, like Archie Bunker, like a Sammy Davis Jr.
Yeah,
Think
yeah,
about Rob Reiner, who, yes, his character represented the college educated elite. And, in the
yeah,
70s was when everybody was sending their first family members to college.
yeah,
And it was college was seen as the great rise provider of opportunity. And here Archie was a working class stiff, resentful of this college kid who also happened to be a Polak.
yeah,
Um, but Rob Reiner is Carl Reiner's son,
yes,
himself, one of the Mount faces on the Mount
yep,
Rushmore of television comedy.
yeah,
So,
oh yeah,
so what you had was the artistic community at that time being very supportive
yes,
of of what Norman Lear was doing.
yeah,
And I'm sure you read biographies of him, there was blowback from the network, and do we go this far? Do we go that far? And you mentioned the Sammy Davis Jr. episode. I remember the episode with the drag queen,
yeah,
who gave Archie a kiss and then took his wig off and said, "I'm a man, baby." And just the prolonged laugh from the live before a live studio audience,
yes,
which I think also provided some of the shock value and the laugh value. And then in the end of that episode, the character was killed off,
mhm,
and Archie kind of showed a little bit of humanity there. So, you know, I and let's also talk a little bit about that actor who played Archie Bunker.
oh
There's a
yeah,
very popular Facebook meme now that talks about, and I'm sure it's on other platforms too, that talks about how young all of these actors and actresses really were when they
mhm,
were portraying these late middle-aged, surly characters. They were 10
mhm,
and 20 years younger than the characters who they were portraying.
right,
And, Carol O'Connor and Gene Stapleton both
yeah,
did an amazing job, playing into that stereotype of the white, waspy, Anglo-Saxon, working class person who was afraid that their world was going to change
yeah,
because of all of these new things coming into their world.
yep. Yeah, it's very true. And first of all, yeah, big props to Carol O'Connor, who's one of the great actors, period, of not only that time, but maybe of all time. Because I just remember in the '80s, he was on a show called In the Heat of the Night, where he played a Southern sheriff. And I just remember all I knew about Carol O'Connor was Archie Bunker. And when I saw him, playing Chief Gillespie, I was like, Carol O'Connor, Archie Bunker, and I was like, wow, he's really good. So he and Gene Stapleton, I don't think she gets enough love because she played kind of the character who was trying to understand the changing times. She had a husband dragging her back to the olden days. She grew up in a different time. Her character had a level of complexity that I don't think enough people appreciate. And she really was the one person who stood up to Archie in her own little kind of sweet, high-pitched, voicey way. But she would dunk on Archie on the regular. So you're right. That show was and again, some people are going to say, oh, here comes the get off my lawn moment, but they really, the television shows, even the comedies back then, had layers to them that really made you think while you were laughing. And Carol O'Connor was one. Another iconic enterprise we'll call is Mary Tyler Moore. Not only revolutionary because she had her own production company as a woman in the 70s, but look at the tree. And hers did not involve things you can't say on television now, but I just got to give her some props. We're talking about 70s TV, but you had Mary Tyler Moore, Rhoda, Phyllis. There was a whole Lou Grant. There was a whole tree off of the Mary Tyler Moore show. And again, playing a character that was pretty damn revolutionary back then.
Okay, so all right, so it sounds like we're moving away from Norman Lear. So
I mean,
so
yeah,
again,
let's
this
think.
could all be the stuff
Yeah,
of future episodes, but I did forget to make mention of one important Norman Lear show, Good Times.
yes. Oh yeah,
The spin-off of the spin-off,
yeah, yeah,
was Good Times. And so
yes,
that was a look at African American working class culture of that time where the Jeffersons, moved on up
yep,
and were dealing with their deluxe apartment in the sky and all of
right,
the things that that entailed. But let's talk about Mary Tyler Moore, an icon of American arts. Remember, in the 60s, for our time,
yep.
she was one of the first women, in fact, I think the first woman to regularly wear slacks
Oh yeah,
on a television show. And
yep,
she had to fight for that right to wear slacks when she was playing Dick Van Dyke's wife on the Dick Van Dyke Show.
yep.
So let's talk about how groundbreaking that was. And with the Mary Tyler Moore show, you go to the theme song. You're going to make it after all.
Yeah.
You know, she's showing her own destiny. She's her own person. She's off in the far flung world of Minneapolis,
Uh-huh.
doing it her way in a newsroom that is chock full of male stereotypes and and Betty White,
Yeah.
who was the much more traditional giggle along to get along,
Mhm.
sort of character. And then, the lovely Georgia Engel, who played the clueless, the resident ditzy lady on the cast. So
Did anybody in TV comedy history do it better than she did? She was on several shows playing that same type. She did that so well.
no, she was perfect. She
Yeah.
was absolutely perfect. She was pitch perfect. And then her friends were Rhoda and Phyllis, and they
Yep.
both got their own shows.
Yep.
And this was not just, through this TV character, a social awakening was fueled, and it continued in a cycle that's similar to what one would envision out of a fusion reactor.
Right.
Because remember why Mary Tyler Moore was significant? Because it was the women's lib movement, it
Yeah.
was the ERA,
Hmm.
it was showing that women can do the same things as men. And I
Hmm.
know, and then we jump forward 5 or 6 years, and then we move into another realm. We were move into the world of movies,
Yeah.
and Goldie Hawn gives us Private Benjamin,
Oh yeah.
which says that a woman can even be in the army,
Absolutely.
and so, but again, back to the television aspect of it, again, CBS shows, and we probably need to get off CBS at some point because we're
Sure.
saying that they did all this stuff, although they kind of did. Um,
Well, there's a
but
whole
but
story behind
but
that. That's
again,
a whole different.
they gave this voice
Yeah.
to these at the time progressive
Yeah.
thinking points of view. So then I think you have to ask ourselves, what does all this say? And I think what it says is that you have to have these sorts of topics
Mhm.
put out into the open in order to have a proper conversation about them, in
Yeah.
order to demystify them, to make them not so taboo.
Yeah, and I will say that to give not to crush on today's television too bad, but we really went through a long period of mindless, brainless television where it was just about entertaining and not going anywhere, which is why I became such a fan of shows like Modern Family and Blackish because they went where some of these 70s shows went during their time. But you're right, there's a whole CBS story and why they ended up getting the Mary Tyler Moore uh, I call it the Mary Tyler Moore universe and the Norman Lear universe coming out of the 60s. That's a whole different topic about where CBS was going into the 70s. But going over to ABC, since we're gonna, not just give all the love to CBS, what they did and some of the shows they got into, and you have to talk about maybe the gay and lesbian community. We talked about Soap and Billy Crystal's iconic portrayal, and you could there was definitely a different treatment of homosexuality with the Billy Crystal character than the married, the adoptive same-sex married couple on Modern Family. On Modern Family, it was normal. I mean, I don't even remember there being a whole lot of jokes that certainly I can remember that landed against Mitch and God, I forget Mitch's husband's name, but the
Was it
couple.
Larry?
No, it was anyway
I
because
can't remember it
Mitch
either.
was
I
Mitch was
should.
the son and his husband, and then But anyway, but it was truly a Modern Family. But if you remember some of the lines that Billy Crystal's character, the incoming that he took for being gay, that was a big deal, and it's stuff. It got into the area of slurs, and you could not do that today. Think about Jack Tripper on Three's Company, and
Yes.
the fact that he had to portray himself as gay so that he could live with Janet and Chrissy, and some of the jokes that Norman Fell landed on, you talk about the late greats, the late great John Ritter, some of that interaction between Norman Fell, who was hysterical as Mr. Roper, and Jack Tripper. And even think about, an actor like Tom Hanks. What was his first start? A show called Bosom Buddies, where he had to play a cross dresser to live in a certain apartment. And some of the lines that came in because they had to do that. Could any of those characters or those shows exist today with some of the dialogue that went on between those characters and others? I mean, could you have a dialogue between Jack Tripper and Mr. Roper today with some of the things that you heard, like Tinkerbell and some of those other terms? I'm thinking not.
You just hit again every bumper on the pinball machine that I was thinking of. Jack Tripper and how his character was portrayed, and also Bosom Buddies. I don't think that those sorts of conversations about homosexuality or gender, and there are some very rudimentary conversations about gender identity
Yeah.
that happened on Bosom Buddies.
Yeah.
You couldn't have that sort of a discussion today.
Mm-hmm.
um you know uh, you know I'll take a little bit of a different spin on this,
Mm-hmm.
and I will talk a little bit about the shows that I would like to see and that taboos I would like to see talked about that we won't see today. And there are two. One is, I think, the entire gender identity issue just
Yes.
needs to be splayed out in the open.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what happens, but if you have like a gender fluid version of Friends,
Mm.
where there are folks, cast members who are cis, trans,
Yes.
everything, they're diverse, you know, what does that look like and how do you do that? So or like How I Met Your Mother,
Mhm.
by the way, wouldn't it have been awesome if the narrator in How I Met Your Mother was a woman? That would
Yeah.
have been pretty cool.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. um the other thing is this red and blue nonsense
Hmm.
and this demonization of somebody because they're on this side or they're on that side.
Yeah.
That needs to be brought out in the open and called BS on. And popular culture has a wonderful opportunity to do that. And on both these scores, it's whiffing. And I don't
Yeah.
understand why.
Well, you talk about red versus blue. I mean, Archie Bunker in a way was that. I mean, that really was a little bit. I mean, you could imagine Archie Bunker being a Trump supporter. Um, you could imagine um, Meathead. It's so funny. You can't remember the guy's name. Everybody just says, "Oh yeah, Gloria and Meathead." Um,
Rob Stivic was the character's name.
okay, I just have a hard
Oh
time.
no, Michael Stivic. It was
Yeah,
Mike Stivic.
yeah.
Rob Reiner, Mike Stivic.
You can imagine him being like a Bernie Sanders supporter type. So really, again, ahead of their time, but still topical. And you're right. I mean, there. And don't get me started on Friends. I just can't with Friends. I would just blow that thing to hell and probably lose all of our
I
viewership.
have never watched an episode of Friends front to back. Actually, that's not true. I watched one by accident on streaming recently. So I've seen like maybe one or two.
Yeah, I've seen a couple, and that was a couple more than I needed to see. But
Yeah,
anyway,
too white,
um, yeah,
too delightfully middle class than me. A couple of the characters are cute, but I had no use for that show.
yeah, and too unrealistic in New York City. But anyway, but you're right. I mean, a show like that, especially in this day and age, somebody, today's version of a Norman Lear coming up with something that gets into red blue. You're right. A series starring or featuring a trans character, even one who maybe it's a teenager, a better version of 90210, where you maybe have somebody who decides to go through a change as far as gender identity, and get into that storyline. I mean, there are so many things out there today that you could come up with some really smart television that had a really good message that could be funny as hell. I mean, that was the thing about the Norman Lear stuff. That was the thing about a show like Soap. You know, I don't know about you, but I did not feel or sense how offensive some of that stuff was until I got older and I started seeing how things evolved in society. And I thought back, I'm like, man, that stuff in the 70s. And let me give a shout out to another ABC show that was very short lived, but it's kind of one of my guilty pleasures as a kid, Carter Country, where
Yes.
it was from the same folks who gave us What's Happening. By the way, Doobie Brothers two-part episode of What's Happening is the greatest thing in television ever, and I'll go from there. But Carter Country was from the same folks that gave us What's Happening, and yeah, that show. I mean, you want to talk about every racial stereotype that you could come up with. I mean, that show was off the just whole next level. You have no shot at putting that show on today.
Now now we're going into a couple other things, and we've got about 5 minutes left. But
Okay.
I think we can very quickly agree that the '90s were absolutely devoid of any groundbreaking television. We
Yeah.
might be wrong on that, but I'm going to stand on that for the time being. I mean, there's probably stuff to talk about TV of the '80s, Different Strokes, um, Facts of Life,
Hmm. Yeah.
a lot of other TV programs. God, I'm blanking on them now that were worthwhile talking about. I mean,
Sure.
even like Fresh Prince or something like that. But I think we should spend our waning minutes on shows where it's probably for the better that the culture is not there. Dukes of Hazard.
Yes. That could
Okay, I
go.
don't think we need a car called the General Lee anymore.
Yes.
I just don't think, a show that I would say would be on the edge, kind of as you're talking about Carter Country, but a spinoff of Soap, Benson,
Benson. Yeah.
because while I think the characters did a good job at skewering this culture, there was also a lot of that antebellum,
Yeah.
white Southern privilege, racist, you know, culture in there that was being played for giggles. So, that those shows, maybe I'll say one and a half, but I'm kind of glad that they're not around.
Well, I will say this: Benson was entertaining because it had a really strong cast, and I think the characters were played very well. To your point, and it was good television to watch. Robert Guillaume, I thought was just hysterical. Although I think his character showed better on Soap than it did on Benson, but
Absolutely.
it was not bad. Dukes of Hazzard, absolutely. I mean that show. Um, I think at some point somebody tried to. Well, they did a movie that I'm glad the way they did it because they did it as a stupid movie instead of trying to take themselves seriously. So I think Johnny Knoxville and the other guy,
Sean William Smith.
yeah, I think they were perfect to do that movie because it was just a goofy movie, and that's the only way you could have redone that movie. If you try to take yourself even remotely seriously, as the TV show tried to, it it would have just looked horrible.
And
And oh,
and,
by the way,
and they're
they
all
took the flag off the car in the movie.
well, and there also is now a custom car that is a metallic blue Dodge Charger that gets around to a lot of car shows now with a number 50 on the side and the American flag on the roof. And the guy who created that car calls it the General Grant, which I think is awesome.
Yeah, I like that. Oh,
So
that's
any
funny.
closing thoughts as to the TV we grew up with? Incidentally, Steve, well, I thought that Pearl O'Connor actually was Archie Bunker. And you mentioned In the Heat of the Night, I was amazed that he had an actual voice. I thought that Carol O'Connor naturally spoke with a Queen's accent and was over the top and would gesticulate madly.
Yeah.
But any closing thoughts in our waning minutes/seconds?
Well, two things. One, it's amazing we talked all this time about 70s television and never brought up MASH. How we pulled that
My
off,
God.
I have no idea. We mentioned the 70s show and don't mention the greatest show of that era, maybe the greatest television show of all time. How we pulled that off, I have no idea, but we did. We'll have to give
Well, I
MASH some
mean,
love on
well,
another
I,
episode.
I think there's a separate episode to be done all about MASH in there. But I mean, I think we've been focusing on social topics. But let's face it, I mean, MASH. When did the movie came out in 1970? The
Yep.
show started in, I believe, about 1972, 1973,
Yeah.
just as we were pulling out of Vietnam. And it goes to show a couple of things. One, war sucks.
Yeah.
And two, people who are over there fighting wars are actually noble people. It's not their fault.
hmm But yeah, you're absolutely right, and that was the beauty of that show. How a show could be funny and pull at your heartstrings at the same time. I mean, just brilliant television. But anyway, that's the one thing. My other thought is, I hope people can appreciate as we've taught what a shock it was for some of these shows because as kids we watched reruns of shows from the 50s and 60s. So when I'm little, I'm watching I Love Lucy and Father Knows Best and on and on and on. Shows like that, maybe something from the 60s, Green Acres, maybe My Three Sons, etc. And then here comes Carol O'Connor, and here comes the Mary Tyler Moore universe, and here comes all these other shows. And then ABC says we've got to do our own thing, and NBC finally caught up in the 80s. They kind of sucked in the 70s for the most part, but it the shock it was of seeing some of these shows and what they brought to us and what they made us think about. Again, you're right, Bill. There are things that you could do today, but I don't know if they would land the way the 70s did coming out of the 50s, coming out of the 60s. I don't know that we've been through an era where coming out of it, we could have something that hits that hard. So that's the thing to really appreciate. And the fact that you're right. Society has changed and those shows aren't doable. And that's it.
Well, we got to get going.
We out.
So we're at the end of our time, but next episode we talk about the start of baseball season. So for Steve, my name is Bill. You have watched, but before we go or listen to, and now we are going. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.